Michael Irons, Worlds Old and New, by Nathan Moore. Chapter 14, Isolated Mimicry. The full moon washed the high desert's meager hills and shallow valleys in enough pale light that even a decent pair of eyes could detect a coyote's cautious movements from over half a mile away. Unconcerned by this lack of stealth, Michael Irons strode southward with lengthy, even strides, his long black coat and wide-brimmed hat rendering him a detached shadow moving of its own free will. In the distance there came the abrupt and heavy movements of a startled antelope, its hoof falls blunted by the scrub grass and loose soil. The animal ran straight at Irons, then, realizing his presence with a start, it darted hard to the right and fled into the night. Irons took to what shadows the lean trees could provide and slunk forward at a half crouch, one flintlock pistol drawn, held low but cautious and ready. There were voices ahead, loud and sometimes slurred, arguing in a relaxed and rural dialect of Spanish. As he drew near, Irons finally caught sight of three men, each ambling loosely under the moon's ample light. One carried a bow and was being berated by the other two as they presumably sought a stray arrow meant for the vanished antelope. All lacked sobriety, but none were unbalanced with drink. No ranged weapons besides the bow could be seen. Irons drew his other pistol, leveled the first at the man with the bow, then stepped forward into the pale light. "From where do you hail, comrades?" he asked in English-accented but largely acceptable Spanish. All three men stumbled and uttered startled oaths. Irons noted that each one reached on instinct for swords none of them currently possessed. The four persons regarded one another in silence for an abrupt, awkward moment, during which Irons took their measure. Their garments were worn but adequately stitched and patched. A vest on one and a light jacket on another were both pieces of a uniform he recognized, specifically belonging to a Spanish company from whom almost 50 men had deserted over 1 month previous. The purple and gold accents easily identified the unit, one which Irons had become gradually familiar with over the past grueling 3 weeks. "I desire to speak with your captain," Michael Irons announced, lowering both pistols, though he did not holster them. The three men, still stunned with mouths agape, tried to gauge this new figure. "Were I here to arrest you," he offered further, "would I have come alone?" This prompt seemed to strike some rationality into the deserters, who began to look upon him with appraisal rather than astonishment. "What do you wish from the captain?" asked the one with the bow, a somewhat shorter, round-faced person. His more round appearance struck Irons as more cook than soldier, especially when stood between his taller, lankier companions. "A matter of business," Irons allowed, now holstering his pistols, though he casually kept his left hand on its corresponding weapon. "Business I cannot fulfill unassisted." "Oh?" The man with the bow seemed amused by this. The smiles which formed on the faces of his companions seemed to support this sentiment. He then seemed about to say something, but stopped himself, shrugged, and decided. "As you happened upon us with pistols drawn, I believe it would be in our best interest to humor your efforts. We will take you to the captain, but, I warn you, we are quite satisfied with our current state of affairs." Irons made a shrug of his own in wordless response. The man heaved his shoulders a final time and motioned for Irons to follow, which he did. The camp was nearby, cradled within a sparsely wooded river valley. They arrived before the night was even half past, the full moon high in the cloudless sky. As the group approached, they were stopped by guards keeping watch on the perimeter, on high alert at the sight of a new face, taking particular interest in the fact that Irons was armed and English. Irons was asked a few cursory questions, then a sergeant was called. The sergeant, a weasel-faced man with a shaven head, drew near with a cautious pace and studied Irons from the corner of his eye, and Irons in turn wondered if perhaps the man had poor eyesight or was trying to appear cunning. "What kind of business?" the deserter's sergeant asked directly, his voice a terse hiss. A shipment, enunciated Irons, and he produced a genuine nugget, holding it aloft so that the nearby campfire might catch the precious metal contained therein. Silver, mined 100 miles to the east, en route to Baja, raw and unmarked. How many guards? No more than a dozen, guaranteed. If it is silver, they will not trust local law or mercenaries. The guards will be Spanish military, assumed the sergeant, trained and well equipped. Precisely why I need your aid, Irons agreed. I know an ambush point. A coordinated volley with enough rifles resolves the matter in a moment. As I informed your comrades, my need is simply for capable manpower. The sergeant swayed a bit with intrigue, but his narrowed eyes did not appear convinced. I cannot imagine, said the sergeant, that we were the first group of outlaws you approached. We are, he gestured with open palms to the valley around them, not easily found, nor do we possess any reputation. At least none which I am aware, apart from our desertion. Deserters, yes, but with the requisite training regardless, Irons insisted. And you know the guard's tactics as well as the language. He shifted his weight into a more even-footed stance and smiled. It may have been a bit difficult to track you down, but I am the kind of man to choose the one correct tool for the job. Experience has taught me to trust planning and execution instead of throwing bodies at a problem and praying for the best. Irons put knowing emphasis on the last phrase. He was very aware of the reasons for these former soldiers' desertion, and the meat grinder their company had been fed into, pithily assured that, instead of cannons, they would be supported by prayers. The sergeant took Irons' meaning and made an involuntary grim smile at this dark humor, then laughed and crossed himself, the motion half ironic, half sincere. Irons returned the smile with good nature, and the surrounding deserters shared a semi-sober chuckle. Some modest victuals were brought, and the captain was called. The captain approached within a minute. He was a taller, well-built man in his mid-30s, the third son of an aristocratic family, now disgraced and likely disowned due to his desertion. The captain drew near with a smile, which was returned by the sergeant and his men. Irons' own smile disappeared as the man drew near. I hear you have a... The captain's voice trailed off as he saw Irons. His jaunty gait slowed for a few steps, then he stopped 7 paces away. The abrupt unease made eyes flit back and forth between the captain and Irons. Smiles and good nature began to fade, while a few hands trended toward pistols. Before any firm motion could be taken, Irons spoke, eyes fixed on the captain, but he addressed the other men present, his voice low, even, and deadly serious. Tell me, Sergeant, was there a time, perhaps a week or two after your desertion, in which the captain seemed odd? There was a long moment while Irons allowed the sergeant and the men to consider this. Forgetful, perhaps, of things which he should have no second thought. Now a few hands could be heard against leather holsters, and a blade or two began to creep from their sheaths. Do not draw, urged Irons. Mine are already cocked and in hand. As the sergeant looked down, the barrel of a flintlock raised with profound swiftness to meet his gaze. In the same instant, the second pistol rose also, aimed toward the captain. That, Irons stressed each syllable, is not your captain. And to further demonstrate his purpose and conviction, Irons moved the pistol aimed at the sergeant over to the captain as well, leaving all others present unmarked, this action and his utterances leaving the soldiers still uncertain and fearful for their captain. Sergeant, if you would please, Irons stated again, almost in entreaty had his words not been so forceful. Consider, have you, or any man present, felt a moment of unease in this man's company, as if something were not as it should be? Sergeant, the man who seemed to be the captain found his voice. Kill this man. Regardless of what happens to me, draw your weapons and end him. Has one of your battle brothers deserted since you left the army? Iron's voice cut off the sergeant's thoughts. Several, perhaps. Was your company not 10 men stronger? And did you not hear that there are indeed violent natives in this region? A wonder that they have let you be. Iron's weight shifted toward the captain, and now his full attention came to bear on his prey alone. Or do they know better than to come within a dozen miles of your camp? Another moment of long silence. Then the captain's mouth, warped in a mocking smear, almost twitched, but he was cut off as Iron spoke again. Sergeant, may I impose upon you? As no reply was immediate, he pressed on. I would like to shoot this thing. Now the sound of blades and pistols alike being slowly drawn resumed. However, Irons could hear that not all present had done so, the sergeant included. Enough had heeded him, and for those who did not, perhaps the captain was not the only perversion present. Sergeant, you and your men are in grave danger. If my words have sparked even an inclination toward the truth, Irons enunciated, allow me. The reply was slow coming, then almost inaudible. Yes. Both flintlocks erupted in twin fire strikes of spark and smoke, both shots finding the corresponding eyes toward which they had been directed. So stunned were all present, it seemed as if nothing were done for a whole second, while all peered in wide-eyed astonishment at the captain. For his body remained bolt upright, head flung back, smoking from the simultaneous impacts. The silence erupted into a chaos which ran through the entire camp, the remaining deserters converging from watch or caught, drawn and alarmed by the sound of gunfire. What stunning effect the sudden action had shattered, and all present drew guns and swords, leveling each weapon at the man in black, screaming for his surrender. Irons raised both gloved hands, spent pistols pointing to the night sky. His face remained calm. Then he began to step away from the still standing body. His first step very slow, his second more swift and certain, despite the sounds of hammers cocked. Then, when Irons holstered his pistols, then the sergeant turned toward a strange sound which he somehow caught despite the noise. Others must have also noticed, because the angry cries and calls began to subdue, until all that could be heard was the crackle of campfires. The captain's head had begun to right itself, despite the twin craters blasted into his skull. There was no blood, merely flesh, brain, and bone shoved aside by the blasts, as if the balls had been shot into and then caught by warm clay. The sergeant, an able veteran in his own right, drew with numb hand his own pistol, and wordlessly aimed it at the deformed face of what he had thought to be his captain. The hollowed face turned to regard him despite the lack of eyes. With a childlike expression of abject horror, the sergeant shot, carving a new hole in the form's chest. Then, without hesitation, he drew his sword and plunged it into and through the formless head. The array of drawn weapons became wildly uncertain. A few remained aimed at Irons, others shifted towards the sergeant, but most weapons were either lowered or aimed with shaking hands toward the creature that had just been their captain. For several long moments, nothing happened, and no one seemed to notice when Irons began to step further back, now with more rapid steps, his eyes taking careful measure of each face in the campfire light, noting the faces of each man who did not appear surprised. The captain twitched once, then his throat erupted and coiled up the sergeant's sword fast as an adder, propelled by his innards which writhed into view as if a nest of vipers erupted from hibernation, its wriggling tendrils splitting, seeking, then driving into the sergeant's eyes and mouth. The next moment, the sergeant seemed to both leap and be pulled towards the captain in an almost boneless, violent action, as his body began to break, bleed, then erupt in worm-like tendrils. Gunfire and screams erupted, except only half were aimed at the captain. The other half were unleashed at 6 soldiers who had likewise begun to erupt from their arms and legs or spines, bones and tendons extending, violently grasping to embrace their fellows. Bloody chaos reigned. Michael Irons, however, had already been hard at work. The The munition stockpile had been swiftly located, and he had begun to throw powder barrels into the various campfires. Then, while these began to burn, he acquired smaller bags of powder, which he cut open with his hunting knife to scatter the black powder about the camp, taking special care to inundate its perimeter. His work over the past several weeks had familiarized him with these particular hellspawn creatures, having tracked and burned all 10 who had tried to go their own way as the deserters moved west. Irons knew well how fast he needed to act. Already the sergeant's screams had stopped, and his body shook as it turned inside out, then right side again, and began to reanimate anew, finger by finger, then limb by limb. All around, every still human soldier had been grabbed or pierced or crushed, and now only a few still screamed their pitiable last. None escaped. "May this violence serve as your perdition," whispered Irons as the first ammunition box erupted. "May the Lord judge it acceptable penance and spare you from the ninth circle." The entire camp erupted and became engulfed in flame. Irons withdrew a small vial of holy oil, already half used during the other instances of his journey, uncorked it, and flung its contents towards the inferno in the shape of the cross. The unholy sounds of the perversions rose in pitch as their anger became fear, then inhuman howls of agony and death. Michael Irons made a torch and patrolled the great fire's perimeter with a particular and careful eye to seek even the smallest trail or impression. When dawn broke and the last fire had all but turned to embers, he counted each twisted, charred remnant. Even the sergeant's near-perfect assimilation and recreation had not concluded. With some time and effort, all bodies were accounted for. Irons then pushed the forms into a pile to further immolate what remained. Only after each warped corpse was naught but ash did he allow himself a sigh of relief. Creatures though the perversions seemed, they were still monsters of hell, not beasts of earth, and could only take bodies occupied by souls. After his first encounter, he had tried to tempt the captured creature, first with a live rat, then a dead corpse. But it had ignored both, consuming neither, and remaining fixated on him alone. A small mercy amidst the vast horror, but still he whispered a prayer of thanks. For if such a thing consumed mice or insects or, God forbid, simple grass, then... He shuddered at the thought and redoubled his gratitude under the breaking dawn of a new day.